A silent encounter in the middle of the forest. The velvet trap laid by a supposed friend. The ultimate reckoning that follows, a man's journey towards wisdom. The sun dipped below the horizon, showering its fiery hues into the darkening sky. A solitary tree stood defiant in the midst of a desolate clearing, its gnarled roots clutching the earth like an old guardian. Beneath its shade lay a man, his breath shallow, his body battered. Blood stained his tattered clothes, and his trembling hand clutched at his side, fighting a losing battle against pain and time. The world blurred around him, yet his ears remained sharp. Then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crushing dry leaves echoed in the stillness, each step growing louder, closer. His heart raced, a flicker of hope mingling with unease. Who could be wandering this forsaken place? Friend or foe? Through half-lidded eyes, he glimpsed a silhouette emerging from the fading light, framed by the fiery remnants of the sunset. A woman, dressed in simple but elegant attire, her long hair flowing like threads of midnight silk. She carried a wooden bucket, brimming with water that glimmered in the twilight. She stopped when her gaze fell upon him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Her face, serene and composed just seconds ago, turned into an expression of shock. The bucket slipped from her hands, tumbling to the ground. Water splashed across the parched earth, the sound as loud as thunder in the silence.
Who?
She began, but the words barely escaped her lips. The man coughed, a guttural sound that racked his body and painted the corner of his mouth red.
Help me.
He rasped, his voice barely audible, more a plea than a command. But she didn't move. Her feet rooted to the spot, her hands trembling. She stared, as if seeing a ghost, or perhaps remembering one.
Why are you here?
She whispered, her voice laced with something more than shock. Fear? Anguish? The words were strange, as though meant for someone else entirely. The man's vision blurred again, the edges of her form shimmering like a mirage. But her voice anchored him, gave him a thread to cling to. He struggled to speak, his lips forming words that never quite reached the air. The woman knelt suddenly, breaking her trance, her hands hovering hesitantly over his injuries.
You're losing blood. Stay awake!
She said, her tone now urgent, almost commanding. She pulled a scarf from around her neck, tearing it into strips to bind his wounds.
You know me?
He managed to ask, his strength fading as darkness crept in. Her hands froze. Her eyes darted to his, wide and full of unspoken emotion.
No.
She lied, her voice trembling. But the way her hands trembled betrayed her words. As the man succumbed to unconsciousness, a thought lingered in her mind, heavy and haunting.
Why is he here?
The air shimmered with heat waves, the midday sun blazing mercilessly over a dusty marketplace. Years ago, before power and wealth gilded his name, a young man toiled under this same sun, his hands blistered and his heart hardened by a relentless world. His name was Kyousuke. Poverty was his shadow then, clinging to him like a stubborn illness. But Kyousuke had clawed his way out of the abyss. Through sleepless nights, countless failures, and sacrifices that left his heart cold, he built an empire of wealth. Now he sat atop the city like a king on a gilded throne, draped in expensive clothes and commanding rooms with his mere presence. To Kyousuke, his riches were not just treasures. They were armor, forged from his blood and sweat, shielding him from the cruelty of his past. He told himself that the poor were architects of their own misery, choosing sloth over sacrifice.
If I could rise above it, then anyone can.
He often declared, his voice filled with pride. It was that pride, razor-sharp and unyielding, that blinded him to the quiet truths around him. He walked through the bustling streets now not as a fellow struggler, but as an observer watching with disdain. A young boy selling newspapers, lazy, a woman begging for food, undisciplined. From the shadows of an old storefront, she watched him. She always had. Aya had seen the full arc of Kyousuke's rise. every moment of desperation, every ounce of determination. She admired him once, even rooted for his success from a distance. But as his success grew, so did his arrogance. He forgot the sting of hunger, the shame of rejection. Now, his eyes carried contempt instead of compassion. Aya knew what he didn't, that not every cage of poverty could be shattered by sheer will. She had seen families crumble under circumstances beyond their control. Illness, war, loss, unseen forces that Kyousuke's hardened heart refused to acknowledge. One day, as he walked past a group of street vendors, Kyousuke's scornful gaze lingered on an elderly man struggling to lift a sack of rice. The man stumbled, his frail body giving way. The sack burst, spilling grains across the dirt. Kyousuke smirked. Aya's fists clenched at her sides. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd.
Not everyone is showered with your fortune, Kyousuke.
He turned, startled. Their eyes locked. Hers burned with a quiet intensity, while his flickered with recognition, an echo of something long forgotten.
You think poverty is a choice?
She asked, her voice steady, yet sharp.
You've forgotten what it feels like to fight for every breath, every bite. You've forgotten who you used to be.
Kyousuke's smirk faltered. For a fleeting moment, he saw himself in the old man's shoes, but just as quickly, he blinked away. Aya watched him walk away, his head held high, oblivious to the storm brewing within him.
One day,
She thought.
your armor will crack, and when it does, I hope you remember the lives you looked down upon.
The opulent ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Kyousuke thrived in such places, surrounded by the elite. His tailored clothes fit like a second skin, and his smile glimmered with the confidence of a man who had conquered the world. Praises flowed like the gushing river, each word feeding his ego until it grew untouchable, invincible.
Kyousuke, your instincts are unmatched. That investment in steel mill business, brilliant move.
Honestly, you're the standard now. We're all just trying to keep up.
He drank it all in, savoring every compliment like nectar. But behind the admiration, hidden beneath the layers of polite smiles and toasts, lay something darker: jealousy. Among his circle of admirers sat Ryota, a fellow businessman and supposed friend. Ryota's smile was as wide as the others, but his eyes betrayed him, calculating, shadowed with resentment. Every word of praise Kyousuke received was a thorn in Ryota's pride, a reminder of his own shortcomings. The weekly gatherings became a tradition, a symbol of their supposed camaraderie. Fine dining and endless discussions about deals and expansions. Ryota always seated near Kyousuke, his laughter blending seamlessly with the others. But in his heart brewed a sinister resolve. It started subtly. One evening, as their group gathered at Ryota's lavish estate, a feast was laid out like a masterpiece. Ryota served the food himself, his demeanor as affable as ever. But as he served Kyousuke, a tiny vial hidden in his sleeve made its way into the dish. A colorless, odorless concoction. One that worked slowly, so gradually it would seem like the victim's mind was simply failing with time. Kyousuke ate without suspicion, engrossed in tales of his latest success. Each bite was a step closer to the trap tightening around him. Weeks passed, and Kyousuke began to notice subtle changes. A persistent forgetfulness he couldn't shake. A faint ringing in his ears. He brushed it off. After all, his schedule was grueling, and even the strongest men needed rest.
Are you feeling all right, Kyousuke?
Ryota asked one evening, feigning concern as he filled his platter with roasted chicken.
Just tired.
Kyousuke replied with a dismissive wave.
Nothing a good vacation won't fix.
Ryota nodded, his expression sympathetic. Inside, he reveled in the irony. But the concoction worked slowly, steadily. Kyousuke's once sharp mind began to falter in meetings. His energy waned. Behind closed doors, whispers started circulating. Was the great Kyousuke losing his edge? Ryota kept close, offering kind words and unwavering support. One evening, as Kyousuke sat at Ryota's table, He raised his cup of tea for a toast.
To loyalty.
He said, his voice tinged with exhaustion.
To loyalty.
Ryota echoed, a thin smile stretching across his face. His gaze lingered on Kyousuke, who didn't notice the fleeting glint of triumph in his supposed friend's eyes.
Pride blinds,
Ryota thought.
and Kyousuke's pride is the perfect veil for my vengeance.